What I see here is not the idea of people suppressing the truth because they have this right relationship with God and it went wrong, although I think that's partially true. I think the issue is we bring all this kind of metaphysical freight with us to the text, and that guides the questions we ask. And the whole issue of biblical interpretation is learning to ask the right questions that are evoked from the text, not the questions we kind of bring to the text. You probably have to start with verse Romans 1, 18 and following, which speaks of the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and wickedness of humankind or people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And then, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And of course, Paul goes on to talk about all these other things about God and glory and stuff. But one of the key issues in Romans 1, just in terms of kind of what we might call the background text or the background idea, is Paul speaking of people in the present, and those are kind of questions a lot of people kind of bring up. Is Paul talking about people in the past? So there's all these sorts of questions. It's kind of the who is doing what, and the as it relates to human agency and divine power and stuff like that. God has made it known to them. God has made it plain to them. God's attributes can be clearly seen or visualized and all those sorts of things. So one of the big questions we need to wrestle with is, who is Paul speaking of? Who's the them, right? And what I tend to think, and I mean, it's hard to come down with a very firm conclusion on this, but my sense is Paul is invoking the Genesis narrative. He's probably thinking of Genesis, you might say, maybe 6 through 9, the flood accounts. He doesn't mention the flood, but he does mention issues of, we might say, the decline of civilization or the decline of Eden. And so most scholars recognize kind of Adamic echoes in Romans 1 and Romans, of course, 5. Adam shows up, and Romans 7, I would argue, probably has Adamic echoes, how Adam functions in Paul's kind of scheme. But what you have in Romans 1 is what I think Paul is kind of recapitulating the Adamic story or the Adamic narrative. That is how Adam acted and what Adam kind of incurred. And so you have this idea of humankind being made in God's image, sharing dominion over the land and all the creatures. But then you have the invasion of sin into the cosmos through, deception, Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And so what you have, I think, isn't we might say a philosophical treatise on metaphysics and the capacity to know things or incapacity to know things. What you rather have is Paul's kind of summarizing kind of arc of what happens when people don't live in communion with God or live in right relationship with God. And so instead of being about kind of these, what we like to talk about, logic. I don't see logic in the text. I see ethics that come up later in the text, but Paul seems more annoyed, or rather, Paul seems more keen on the idea that God has revealed God's self. And of course, that's in creation through God's handiwork. And people are essentially taking the creation and worshiping creation rather than the creator, and they became futile in their thinking and their hearts were darkened, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal or human beings, basically, and birds and animals and reptiles in verse 24, right? And so you have kind of this idea of what happens when civilizations or peoples or nations go wrong. And so that's why I think you can talk about, you can have the idea also of this is applied now, so Paul can look at the Roman Empire, he can look at the peoples of the nations and what we might call pagans, so to speak, at least in that sense. But what Paul seems to be really invoking is this past kind of narrative, and how this past narrative of Adam and sin kind of really is speaking to kind of the reality now. And that's, of course, you can go from Adam to Moses to Abraham, in Romans 1-5. You have that kind of nice historical kind of typological sequence. And so here is not the idea of people suppressing the truth because they have this right relationship with God and it went wrong, although I think that's partially true. I think the issue is we bring all this kind of metaphysical freight with us to the text, and that guides the questions we ask. And the whole issue of biblical interpretation is learning to ask the right questions that are evoked from the text, not the questions we kind of bring to the text. And so that's kind of an overview of how I would at least approach Romans 1, at least in the text that we talked about. I don't know if you have thoughts on it and you want to push back, or if you have questions or where you want to go, but that's kind of how I see it. I think it's just simply too much. I think it's importing too much theological freight into the text, where Paul seems to be speaking more, we might say, narratively versus we might think metaphysically. So
who exactly is Paul referring to by people who suppress the truth?
He's probably speaking of, we might say, pagans or people of the nations, the Roman Empire, people that are kind of in that sort of sphere. But he's also drawing off, we might say, the Adamic or the Noahide narrative, where people, or there might even be echoes of Sinai here with the golden calf, the creation of idols, and how idols will distort the human relationship with God, because, of course, as Paul is very keen to say, things cannot represent God. It's kind of the idea of idolatry in many sense. So I think that's kind of who Paul has in mind. I don't think surely Paul's not speaking of himself. He's not speaking of Junia or Andronicus or Phoebe or the other men and women mentioned in other parts of Romans. Paul seems to be very specifically focusing on Gentile nations that have gone wrong. And I think that's clear because it fits in with the narrative of the First Testament with, Genesis, say 1-11, Babel, that kind of whole narrative. And also issues of what happened at Sinai with the golden calf, or other issues of that as well. And so I think he's speaking essentially to idolaters, but he's essentially trying to argue, because he will go on in Romans 9-11 to talk about the mercy and the justice of God in dealing with people who are not in right relationship with him. And so he's kind of already laid the foundation of that. The whole point isn't the universality of sin, although sin is a universal thing. The issue is more along the lines of in what history, in Jewish history and conceptualizing of Jewish history, Paul is considered how God has acted in human history. And here if we go back to Noah, God basically gave people over to what they wanted. And that results in all sorts of sin and destruction and vice. And then, of course, the law comes and Abraham is considered righteous and all of that. So I think Paul has kind of a narrative approach here that often gets overlooked, because it's easy to find a proposition. We just find a good proposition and that does it, and that's all we need. But it's more difficult to think in terms of narrative and categories like that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So what exactly in the text do you see that makes you think of like the golden calf idea right before the flood, all that kind of stuff?
Well, the issue is when did things go wrong? And so we might say, verse 20, since the creation of the world, so this is post-creation, so this is probably where things are beginning to go wrong. So Paul's already kind of presupposed the rupture between humankind and God, right? Because why else would you need the wrath of God to be revealed if we're all in right relationship with God? But namely, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived, or rather have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So you might take that as we might say, a sort of natural theology, or at least some sort of idea of natural theology, that you can look at the cosmic order and there's design there, there's intentionality there. And for Christians, there's character there, because that creation reveals God's goodness, that God desired to create and make things and to be in right relationship with people. And so that's kind of the background of that. But verse 21 speaks of, for although they knew God, they did not honor him. So, all right, you have the disintegration of the creator, we might say the creator God and the creation. So there's a showing of dishonoring or not giving him thanks, but becoming futile in mind, right? Or being given over to a sense of futility or worthlessness, the dehumanization And that includes their minds. And that might be you might find the kind of echoes of Babel there, the creation, and it's not as if Paul's thinking entirely sequentially. He's very compressed in the way he argues, because, Romans 5 has the law, and there's a lot of compressed kind of stuff going on there. But then you have the darkening of the human heart, and claiming to be wise, they became fools. And you can find echoes of so-called wise people thinking they're smart in the First Testament, and at least in the Pentateuch, where they were foolish. And what they did was they exchanged the glory of, we might say, the immortal God for images. So that's already an interesting idea. Icon or icon, image of mortal or corruptible or perishable humankind. So there's already a distinction being drawn between the God who is immortal and humankind, which is not. And so there's already a rift in creation, which may tell us that human beings were not created to be perishable, or at least originally. So we kind of forfeited that in the garden. But then to make being and then birds and animals and creeping things and all that sort of stuff. And so you have kind of this idea of idols and imagery there, which that kind of speaks to me of the golden calf incident. At least the golden calf incident is the best representation of the creation of idols to represent God. The golden calf. And so those are kind of the echoes I see of the Adamic story, or at least the story from the Pentateuch that Moses tells us. And those are that's kind of the background, I think, to this text specifically. And Paul is kind of bringing that into the present. So that's why he can use past tense and present tense and kind of that sort of stuff and verbs. So he's kind of basically saying this story is here now. So it's not as if this was then and this is now. It's like, no, this reveals how humankind has always kind of acted, if that makes sense.
That is actually not something I've ever heard before, so that's very cool. So specifically, as far as like what we can draw out of the text, what in the text do we have to say that it's an innate knowledge, like intuition, possibly from birth, or is it made plain to them? Was it learned from what was made, or where's that come from?
Well, you could argue, this is just an idea. What has been known about God is plain to them. There was no separation between God and humankind in the garden. It was plain because God showed it to them. What's the comment in Genesis? God walked with them. God was present with them. God came down to them, and all that sort of stuff. So you might have that element there. And here, what I kind of get the sense is being made plain is probably the idea that creation is part of the revelation of God. That is, creation is designed to make you, instead of worshiping it, to think bigger, to think better and bigger questions about where this all comes from. And so, someone had to have eternal power and divine nature to make it, for example. And so it has that sense of forcing people to think theologically and philosophically about something, but it seems to imply that people can do that, that they can think about it. They can respond, because what does he say? That people, they didn't glorify God or give thanks to him, and became kind of futile in their thinking and intentionally exchanged or gave up, And so that tells us that human agency is explicitly seen in terms of, it doesn't seem to be that God predestined this or set this up in that sort of way. It seems to be God intentionally seems very, I wouldn't say annoyed, but this doesn't seem to be what God wanted, if that makes sense. And so that tells us a bit about kind of the character of God, how God responds to humankind, but also tells us about the kind of people that God is having to deal with, and so on and so forth.
Not to repeat myself, but the knowledge of God, is it something from birth, or does the text even refer to that?
I think what's interesting is if we read the text carefully, what seems to be straight up said is people knew and then rejected. And whatever that tells us about metaphysics or propositional truth or whatever, people had the freedom to basically, or God gave us, we might say, the freedom to reject or respond to God. And what we did instead of living in right relationship, as we see in the garden, is Adam and Eve basically forsook everything. And that's kind of, I think, so rather than speaking to an innate knowledge or an innate kind of creational kind of capacity, what seems to be said is this is in terms of revelation. God revealed God's self, and revelation and intuition there you need to actually, the presuppositionalists might have to argue that those two need to be combined. if that makes sense, so it's kind of hard to say, you have intuition, but you need revelation. You know what I mean? Because, how do you get these two things? What seems to be the case with Paul here is people were in darkness and God gave them light. And that's the whole message of the incarnation in John 1, right? The light came into the world, but the darkness could not suppress it or push it out or contain it, so to speak. And so the purpose is more on the revelation of God to humankind versus what we do or do not know about God. And it seems to presume that even though we knew God, it seems to imply that there was a right relationship there that got ruptured.
Hey guys, so we had some technical difficulty issues. Here are the interviews rescheduled on a different date.
You mentioned that Romans 1 kind of references Genesis 1 to 11 like quite a bit. It says, for since the creation of the world, it says, for although they knew God. It's kind of like referencing like a relationship, like kind of how Genesis says that Adam and Eve walked with God. It says, exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals, reptiles. It says created things rather than the creator. But then, of course, when you read on, it says even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Do you think that's possibly a reference to Genesis 6?
It's a good question. We often forget that Paul has a very, we might say, grand view of Genesis or grand view of creation. It appears negatively in the text on women as negative examples, when things go wrong, or even his language concerning sex, a lot of it is grounded in, we might say, the creational ideal or the Edenic ideal versus post-Edenic. So yeah, Genesis 6, that's probably one of the references, the flood narrative and stuff like that. Incidentally, one of the most powerful vision or depictions of that is from the movie Noah, right? I don't know if you've seen it with Russell Crowe. Not a great movie, but certainly an interesting movie. Very interesting movie. I loved, I'd say 60% of it, then was bored the rest of it. But the scene where he looks around and sees all this horrific stuff happening and the evil of human hearts and stuff, then he makes a mad dash for the ark. And that's kind of how I view it. I think Genesis 6 and kind of the whole narrative of everything, the heart's being continually wicked. And, so you can see it's not that I'm arguing that there's linguistic parallels per se between, say, the Septuagint and Paul, although you probably could find a few here and there. It's more thematic continuity, Paul. So I think Genesis 6 is certainly a reasonable one. One is also the issues of, say, Levitical law and questions of that sort of stuff, engaging in sexuality, whether it's same sex or disordered from a heterosexual standpoint. A lot of Levitical laws, frankly, towards heterosexual people. If you think about it. So it's just interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really perceptive point. I thought of that, but it's the fact that you said it made me think more about it. So yeah, no, I think that's at least that probably is an echo or kind of a reverberation that kind of is influencing his at least worldview as he talks about Romans 1 and kind of so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, so I've actually read that in commentaries that it could be a reference to Genesis 6, referring to like the sons of God and unnatural relations with, like, well, I guess it depends on what your view of Genesis 6 with the sons of God is, but and then Romans 1:27, but it also says, in the same way the men are also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men. So I guess people have used that to say, oh, this isn't referring to Genesis 6 because there's no homosexuality with men here. But I guess if you take kind of like a narrative, like a kind of category type of view of Romans 1, then that works because it's not referring to like, yeah, maybe it could be referring to these specific stories, but it's also referring to like a whole bunch of different things. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I think you could argue too that, and I think I mentioned this, that Paul is kind of the decline of civilization narrative, when things just break down, go wrong. And so the brokenness of even our bodies, as Paul talks about in Romans 1, but also we see that throughout. I saw a tweet today that made me laugh. It's like, can we really get mad at Cain for hitting Abel? It's not like no one's ever died before. So it's one of those things. But even then, like even the things that, obviously go wrong happen in a way that's incredibly severe and people are living with consequences from that, right? And so I think there is a sense in which the only difficulty with the Genesis 6, Romans 1 kind of, the correspondence is Paul seems to have Gentiles or nations in view, or we would say, crudely pagans, not non-Jews, that's not the right word, non-Christian Jews and or Gentiles, right? The family of God, we might say. And so it's not an exact parallel, because Genesis 6 is obviously speaking more of a corporate whole for humanity. But I mean, even then, there's maybe some similarities as well. So it's an interesting conversation. I'm sure there have been monographs on it and commentaries on it, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah. All right. So something else I wanted to mention was in verse, well, in the passage, there's all these different tenses that Paul uses. So like there's a present referring to, it says, is being revealed in verse 18. It says, who suppressed the truth, so that people are without excuse. What may be known about God is plain to them. So all these are present tense things that are happening. Of course, then it goes into the past, and then it says shifts from the past. Then they have become in verse 29. Like, what do you think Paul was trying to get at when he's like changing the tenses here?
Yeah, we should be wary not of tenses, but of importing a lot of theological freight into tenses. There's a huge debate on, say, the aorist tense in Greek. There's been this huge, aorist usually is defined as an event, just a past event, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the perfected aspect of it or the accomplished act of it, only that an event occurred. He drove down the street, which can imply many different things in kind of issues in Greek and verbal aspect and stuff like that. The tenses changing, I think, is interesting insofar it kind of reveals the ongoing corruptivization or degradation of humankind. And I think you said it helpfully, Zach, was I'm pulling up verse 29, so stalling, just so I can see it. Yeah, they were filled, which is, a perfect tense, but even then there's a sense in which a lot of these verbs are all predicated on the initial act of something going wrong. And if we think in terms of epicycles, right? So we read, say, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation often sounds like it's repeating motifs or themes in kind of a cyclical way, where it kind of comes back to this original idea, but kind of builds on it until the end, and stuff like that. Here, you have what we might call a foretaste of what Paul talks about in Romans 5, sin entering into the cosmic order and kind of wreaking havoc. And that gets picked up succinctly in Romans 7, which I would argue is a reference to Adam, the person in Adam, or the Adamic person. But we see a lot here of Paul's kind of preempting or kind of setting up this sort of argument to kind of where he continually kind of references or goes back to it. He's continually building on this sort of theme. And what I love about what you pointed out is they were filled, or they did this, or they suppressed the truth, or these sorts of things. It seems to suggest intentionality and agency on the part of people acting in response, either positively or negatively, to God or to God's work in creation. And so it's far from it being about kind of the mindset that governs apologetic debates per se. It's far more emphasizing that humankind has fully participated in this, we might say, sin world, this reality of sin or Adam. And it kind of pushes us away. It forces us to ask just different questions, because if we come to it, like asking what presuppositionalists are asking, you're not getting the full sense of what Paul's actually arguing. You're focusing on a very narrow kind of piece. That's not irrelevant, but it's certainly a piece of what Paul's arguing, but it's not the main thrust of what he's arguing, if that makes sense. So it's kind of missing the forest for the trees, so to speak, in that sort of argumentation.
That's understandable, yeah. Yeah. So just to harp on like specifically who's being talked about, because this is something that just like we have to be completely clear about. Not that you haven't been, but just just to be completely clear.
No, for sure, yeah.
So, so you mentioned like this kind of referring to Gentile nations that have gone wrong. The whole thing is about idolatry, like what these people who suppress the truth they do. They worship the created rather than the creator. It says versus for some people that think that like it's referring to everybody who suppresses everyone, like that isn't saved or isn't Christian. Some would say like. It's verse 18 says all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, and then it says verse 20 it says God's attributes have been clearly perceived, so that people like it doesn't say like these past people, it doesn't say like Gentiles, it doesn't say idolaters, it says people kind of like generally are without excuse. So like some people would think that means like literally everyone. That's why they take that view. It's like, what do you think about that?
I mean, it's not an impossible understanding. I mean, I can see the logic of it. And I think I would push back just in the sense of what Paul talks about earlier on, the righteousness that is revealed. And that, of course, has the issue of, okay, is this is being revealed or has been revealed in kind of a maybe a pre-creational sense, maybe like a natural theology kind of thing, or is it revealed in the sense of incarnation, right? Think about Romans 1, right? The very beginning, Christ is exalted and resurrected and as Son of God in power. And so it kind of just brings up a whole host of kind of different questions insofar as we're asking, is this applying to literally every single individual who's ever lived, or is Paul speaking kind of universally in the present, kind of as he is penning it? Is he thinking about would he include himself in this? So how hard do we press the universality of it? I think what you can press universally is the universal impact of sin, and that's of course what is talked about in Romans 5, Romans 3, Romans 7, and kind of on and on and on. But to universalize it kind of seems to kind of push against the argument I think Paul is making, even if I think you can make a reason kind of inference out of it, if that makes sense. So it's not as if the text is being twisted or they're lying or anything like that, but it seems to be over interpreting the point Paul is trying to make, when his point seems to be much more on the universality of sin versus kind of the and so, for example, you'll have people argue that when it comes to the all passages, right? The justification of life for all people, he desires to have mercy on all. The usual retort, unless you're a Universalist or say you're a Wesleyan like me, usual retort from most Calvinists or presuppositionalists, I'm not saying the two are identical, but they tend to fall in the same camp. So just generally speaking, that turns into all types of people, or all kinds of people, or Jews and Gentiles.
Consider verse 6, which says that Jesus gave himself as a ransom for all. But Matthew 20:28 says Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many, not every single person. So again, this means all kinds.
Yep. And so you can see kind of there's a willingness to be universal in some sense here, but not a willingness to be universal in another sense. And I think the issue is, what I would like to see is, and I'm not accusing them of incoherence, I'm suggesting that there needs to be more consistency drawn between these 2 points. And that's just kind of an example I would give. And there's more that could be said, but I think Paul's broader point is the righteous will live by faith. So obviously this isn't every single person, especially, the language of will live. And so there's a future or middle passive there, but also or middle tense, suggesting that this is something that is the human person does in response to God, in response to the righteousness of God that has been revealed or is revealed. And so there is this sense in which you have to ask how much human agency is involved in this, and how do human persons respond to the revelation of God? And that's where I think Paul goes, by denying what God, basically maybe by denying what God has done, maybe the character of God, the God who raised Jesus from the dead and so on and so forth, you are suppressing the truth in that sense, or you're arguing against it, or having a row with it, so to speak. And so I think maybe there's just a lack of kind of consistency across the hermeneutical spectrum, and Romans seems to be the place where all theological method runs and fails and tries to pick up the pieces, and across the board theologically speaking. Romans, the more I read Romans, the more I'm like, boy, no theological method has a claim on Romans, which I find helpful, to be honest.
That's great. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. Other possible views. So like you kind of mentioned in the beginning that you're not like you're 100% certain that this is the specific view. Like, is there any like more credible views that you could think of, or is it just kind of like this is like 80% right, and then the other ones might be part of like 20% right kind of thing?
The second one. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm confident I'm right, but there's always pieces that'll if you're seeking to be honest with the text and seeking to always learn and read, you're always going to find something that either challenges your view, which means you have to correct a little bit or tweak it a little bit, or if you're just straight up wrong like I've been, you just chuck it and take the whole new system. It's more a matter of how much certitude you place in your system and how much explanatory power does it actually have. So for example, if we read this a little bit in Romans 1, from a presuppositional standpoint, that makes sense of this specific passage insofar as we adopt certain theological presuppositions, a form of predeterminism or compatibilism, as it relates to human freedom. A certain view of God's relationship with the world. Does God love everyone? How does this work? And so there's those sorts of questions that kind of arise from that. And the presuppositionalist and or the Calvinist has to kind of account for those before presuppositionalism can be used as an interpretive method. so to speak. And they can do that. I'm not saying it can't be done or it shouldn't be done or anything, but it requires a lot more legwork than I've seen kind of done here.